Hello, everyone. Welcome to your next chapter in fermenting. Today, we're going to go into a little bit more of the history of fermenting and a little bit more of how it impacts our bodies and the world around us. And then we're going to get into making sauerkraut from cabbage. So, scientists, anthropologists have found, anthropologists are people who study people, right? They study people now, study people in the past, and how cultures have grown and evolved, and how people, 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 years ago lived and survived. So these anthropologists and scientists have found that what some of the earliest cave paintings involve showing something called mead. And mead is actually a alcoholic beverage, like a wine of sorts, that you use by taking water and honey and just fermenting that together. Now, these ancient people 12,000 years ago probably weren't, taking honey and pouring it into water and kind of watching and seeing what happened. What they probably found was a tree with a hollow hole in it, where bees might have been before honey was in there, and then it had rained and the hollow had filled, and this mead started to be created, right? Started to ferment. And probably, ancient peoples went in and kind of poked around at it. What is this bubbling thing? And they tasted it and it was good. And they had some more and it didn't kill them. And they were probably like, this is interesting. It had honey and water. And it's so interesting that I guess these cave paintings are found in India, Spain, and South Africa of people gathering honey. And I'm finding this information in one of my very favorite books called Wild Fermentation. This is, if you want to get into fermentation or if you're interested at all, this is the book. I love it. It's extremely thorough. And I love that it touches on the cultural aspect of fermentation. So in this book, this is by Sandor Alex Katz. And he says that, this is a quote, it says, the anthropologist and cultural theorist Claude Lévi-Strauss suggests that mead making marks the passage of humanity from nature to culture. So we kind of, once we switched to now making this kind of food, this ferment, we went from just subsisting on nature, hunting and gathering, to now creating our own food with intentionality, which is really, really cool. So another couple things that I do want to talk about that Mr. Katz brings up in his book are just a couple of ideas that we have touched on before. But one of them is that fermenting foods is a huge way of preserving foods. So when you're making ferments, you're not just making food, you're taking, a cabbage head, right, that in a month's time could seriously decay and decompose, right? Remember that word that we learned about a couple weeks back, could decay, decompose, and rot. So you're saving this fresh vegetable and you're turning it into something that can last years if stored properly. So, civilization kind of took off with these ferments because now people could take, what they found out in the wild and then could preserve them for long periods of time, meaning that they could be ensured that they would have food for months, years, maybe even quite a few years down the line. So if you've got a stable food source, well, then you can build a city, you can build a civilization. It's just absolutely fantastic how ancient peoples, and truly it is ancient peoples all over the world, they're documenting, we've got the misos from Asia, we've got cassava root from Africa, and what else? Tempes and Cassava might be from South America now that I just said that. It was from Africa. It's from South America. Anyways, you're taking these foods, and because you can store them for long periods of time, you get to create a culture. You get to have more people. So once you're done making the ferments, they can be stored at room temperature for a short period of time, or they can be stored in some form of cold storage. Now, obviously, ancient peoples didn't have refrigerators, but what they would do often is dig big holes in the ground, insulate them maybe with straw, mud, and then that would be their, the earth is cool underneath in the crust. It's cool. So they would store their ferments in the ground. And what I actually thought was really, really interesting after reading a little bit more of this book and listening to some podcasts and reading a couple other fermenting books is that obviously the ancient peoples didn't have glass jars with plastic lids like we do. They had gourds, right? Pumpkins, or sometimes animal intestines. They would sometimes make clay crocks, clay pots. But they would take like pumpkins and make sauerkraut in them. How weird is that? I love that. I think that's super, super cool. So fermentation creates civilization because it preserves food. Absolutely fascinating. I love this. So the other really interesting thing, and it kind of, totally ties in with the history, right? If you've got lots of people to feed, 12,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, you've got lots of people to feed. You've got your civilization. You're going to want food, right, that lasts a long time. You're also going to want food that is rich in nutrients. Now, fermented foods, we already kind of talked about this, how they strengthen the body, right? They aid in digestion in that they can help your body stay healthy with your immune system, which is part of digestion. But then within digestion, they help your body break down the other foods that you're eating and make those nutrients more bioavailable. And that's a fancy term that just means your body can take it in and use it a lot easier than it could otherwise, right? So some foods are actually really tricky for our bodies to digest, whereas fermented foods can help our bodies digest those kind of tricky things, which is really cool. The other really interesting thing about fermented foods is that they actually create more nutrients in the fermentation process. So as they're fermenting the bacteria, remember it's good bacteria that is changing the state of the cabbage, the carrot, the cucumber, the whatever you're fermenting, and they're creating new nutrients. So if you were to eat a cabbage, which is it has vitamin C in it. Let's say we're eating a cabbage with vitamin C. By fermenting it, you're increasing the amount of vitamin C. So a long time ago, sailors used to, go on long sea voyages, and a lot of the sailors would actually die. They would get really sick, and people were like, why are they getting sick? What is going on? Well, if you think about it, let's go back before the refrigerator is made. People are going on these long sea voyages. What kind of foods are they eating? They're going to be eating salted, dried meat and fish. They're going to be eating breads, but like really dry crackers. There's going to be little to no fresh fruit or fresh vegetables. So sailors go on these long voyages. Half of them die on the long voyage. Why are they all dying? They're all dying from something called scurvy. Now, scurvy is totally preventable if you get enough vitamin C. Now, modern humans get enough vitamin C. We don't really have to worry about this. But what they figured out is if they took cabbage, which is high in vitamin C, and they fermented it and brought big barrels of fermented cabbage, right, sauerkraut, on their long sea voyages, and they all just ate a little bit a day, all the sailors, the rates of scurvy plummeted, right? They dropped so much. Barely any sailors were dying from scurvy now, which is fantastic. And now you can't just bring cabbages on a long sea voyage, they'll rot. So again, back to that preservation, or that, keeping food for longer, that fermenting process was able to save these sailors. Now that's just a small example, but it would be able to save civilizations, right? Civilizations that lived in very cold climates where maybe they lost a whole crop, or where they just don't grow much. Well, if they've got these preserved foods, then they're gonna be okay, which is super cool. So this book is wonderful. I'll read you another little quote here. Fermentation also creates new nutrients. As they go through their life cycles, microbial cultures, right, the little microbes, the little bacteria, create B vitamins, including folic acid, riboflavin, niacin, thiamine, and biotin. So those are all different kinds of B vitamins. And sometimes they'll enhance other amounts of vitamins. So just by allowing these bacteria to preserve our food, they're creating all these wonderful vitamins that you'd otherwise have to go find in another food source. Absolutely fantastic. Absolutely riveting. I hope that you guys find fermentation as fascinating as I do. But this book, Wild Fermentation, truly cannot say enough good things about it. Okay, so today we're going to be making sauerkraut. I reached back here because I'm sitting right in front of my fermentation station, which currently I feel like you guys might want to be interested in this. Let me show you. All right.
Got my fire cider there. I've got some jalapeno and serrano peppers that I'm going to make some hot sauce. I've got a kombucha, my fermented garlic, and then my sourdough starter. We're going to do another video on how to make bread. And then we've got the sauerkraut and more fire cider. And then in my fridge, I've got 2 things of pickles and onions.